This is Nadia, and you're listening to University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts.
You're listening to Root of Conflict, a podcast about violent conflict around the world and the people, societies, and policy issues it affects.
In this series, you'll hear from experts and practitioners who conduct research, implement programs, and use data analysis to address some of the most pressing challenges facing our world.
Root of Conflict is produced by UC3P in collaboration with the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts, a research institute housed within the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago.
The war in Afghanistan has ravaged on for decades, and peace negotiations between the Afghan government and Taliban officials during that period have often broken down, time and time again. With a number of foreign actors involved in the conflict and in the negotiations, the most prominent being the United States, reaching a comprehensive peace agreement has proven to be exceedingly complex. But now, with a new set of negotiations taking place in Doha, we may be seeing a window of opportunity to make progress towards peace. My name is Aishwarya Rajay, and in this episode of Root of Conflict, Wangi Thwita and I speak with Laurel Miller, the Asia Program Director at International Crisis Group. Laurel discusses the intricacies of the war in Afghanistan and how they have evolved over the years, and the best-case scenario for what a peace agreement can look like. Laurel, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure to be with you.
Your topic during the Pearson Global Forum was, of course, a case study on Afghanistan, which is undoubtedly a very complex conflict. We could probably do an entire podcast series just to talk about it. But can you give us or lay out for us who the main players have been in this conflict? And from a U.S. perspective, how have our goals in Afghanistan changed over the last 20 years?
Sure. And I should say, I came to this position at International Crisis Group already having focused quite a bit in recent years on policy issues related to Afghanistan. It's one of our priority areas within my current job, which I've been doing not even for 2 years now, but had done some analytical work of my own when I was at the RAND Corporation related to Afghanistan. And I also served in the U.S. State Department from 2013 through the middle of 2017 as the deputy and then the acting special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and was working on issues related to war and peace in Afghanistan at that time. So that's what I drew on in my presentation at the Pearson Forum and in other work that I do. So the conflict there, it's multi-sided and complex, and it has both internal and external dimensions. Often from an American political and popular perspective, we think of the war in Afghanistan as the war that has been there since after 9/11, after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and toppling of the Taliban regime there. And that is one dimension of the war. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan at the end of 2001 because the Taliban regime had harbored Osama bin Laden and had refused to hand him over, and the U.S. took the position at that time that it needed to not only endeavor to capture or kill bin Laden and his associates, but also make an example of the Taliban regime in order to say that state sponsorship, state harboring of terrorists will not be tolerated. So one dimension of the conflict in Afghanistan is that the United States invaded and gradually built up the number of troops on the ground in Afghanistan over several years. After having wiped away the Taliban regime, it was one of the key actors in installing a new government there, putting in place a new constitution, elections, etc. But then the Taliban regrouped from safe havens in Pakistan, across the border from Afghanistan. The Taliban regrouped as an insurgency, and the United States then became embroiled involved in a counterinsurgency war against the Taliban. So that's one dimension. Rolling a little bit back further in time, Afghanistan was not a fully peaceful place before 9/11. There had been a civil war in the early 1990s after the Soviet Union withdrew from the country, and the US, which had been heavily engaged in supporting the anti-Soviet fighters in Afghanistan, including bin Laden. The US decided to exit the region, and the country descended into a civil war in the early 1990s, which then created the opening for the Taliban to sweep to power and hold power in the later part of the 1990s. The Taliban had, by and large, consolidated control of the country, but not complete control of the country. And there was there were dimensions of warfare that were still going on related to that fight, even before the U.S. invaded after 9/11. And so that there's a war still going on in Afghanistan that has a lot to do with what was happening in the 1990s, even before the U.S. invaded. That's another, dimension and layers to the conflict in Afghanistan. And then Afghanistan also is surrounded by often meddlesome neighbors. It's in a very difficult neighborhood. The key players in this regard are both Pakistan and Iran, but others too have over many decades sponsored, favored, proxies and clients in the country, and have helped to perpetuate warfare there through these relationships. And as I mentioned, Pakistan in particular is consequential in that it gave safe haven to the retreating Taliban figures who then regrouped as an insurgency. And so there's another dimension to the conflict and the set of actors in Afghanistan that has to do with the external players within the neighborhood, not to mention the United States and NATO as external players further afield. And Russia and China too have interests and involvement in Afghanistan. So it's a particularly complex conflict because of these both internal and external dimensions that overlap, but also represent distinct sets of interests on the part of all of these players.
So what has changed in the last few years so that there's now more of an emphasis on a negotiated settlement as opposed to achieving a military victory as a precursor to U.S. withdrawal? Even though there's still, like you mentioned during your panel, a low likelihood that a peace agreement will be agreed upon and implemented properly.
So I think you have to look a little bit back in time to see how the U.S. came to this point of being focused on negotiating a settlement and negotiating directly with the Taliban. Initially in Afghanistan, the U.S. saw itself as being, initially after the invasion, as being outright victorious militarily. Didn't capture bin Laden. He famously escaped and later was caught and killed in Pakistan. But the U.S. did very quickly topple the Taliban regime. Over time, was able to pretty much decimate the al-Qaeda presence in the region, and saw itself in those first few years after the invasion as having really, utterly defeated the Taliban. From the time when the Taliban began to reconstitute as an insurgency, in gradually, certainly by 2005-06, it was clear that there was an insurgency. I think it's fair to say from that point on, the war from a U.S. perspective has never gone well. The U.S. from that point began to increase the number of forces steadily. rising to, I mean, even before Obama came into office, there were already a series of surges, and then there was what was literally called a surge in the beginning of the Obama administration. To at the peak, there were 100,000 American forces deployed in Afghanistan. I mean, in 2002, it was like tiny numbers. I mean, like a few thousand at most, and then to 100,000 American forces in Afghanistan at the peak, plus NATO forces for a total of almost 150, between 140 and 150,000. Plus, in any military deployment like this, you then have to multiply, several times more contractors, including doing military-like tasks, in addition to these number of troops on the ground. And the reason why the numbers kept going up is because the war wasn't going well, and the U.S. military advocated for the application of more resources to try to turn it around, to change the trajectory. From the peak period, already by 2013, 14, the number of U.S. forces was diminishing, because the idea was that the surge of forces in the Obama administration was supposed to be temporary. And so there was a plan to surge up and then come down. And at the same time, there was an emphasis placed on building up the capabilities of Afghan security forces to take the lead in the fight against the Taliban, but with still the U.S. engaging in counterterrorism efforts. But even with this sort of peak and then initial decline of U.S. forces there, it was never really turning around. I mean, steadily, the Taliban was steadily gaining ground, and even with the enormous devotion of American resources to building up the Afghan security forces, they still hadn't, and still haven't today, proven capable of entirely on their own handling the counterinsurgency without American backing. From around 2015, when the number of U.S. forces really began to dip, it became even harder for the Afghan security forces, and there were even more gains by the Taliban. And even today, with the numbers of U.S. forces down to almost down to by next week, it's supposed to be down to 4,500. Obviously, the Afghan forces are carrying much more of the burden of the fighting, much, much more, but still in really the most exigent circumstances, they need American military support, particularly air support, meaning like they need the bombing basically of Taliban positions in order to not be overrun by the Taliban. And the Taliban has continued to improve its position. So that's the trajectory of the war fighting. And I mentioned that in answer to your question about the peacemaking, because it's the explanation. I mean, if the U.S. had been militarily successful in partnership with the Afghan government in eliminating the Taliban insurgency, then I don't think anyone would be talking about a political settlement, or they'd be talking about one that's really just negotiating the terms of the Taliban surrender. But that's not the case. There are many people who think if the U.S. started being serious about a negotiation much earlier, it could have negotiated on much more favorable terms. But as the Taliban has gained strength, we are nowhere like in negotiating the terms of the Taliban surrender. It was more than a decade ago now that some American policymakers recognized that the war was not winnable, and that there had to be an effort to begin trying to negotiate a political settlement of the conflict. But for many years, that effort was in fits and starts. It was, well, this is we're going to keep going with the war effort, and this is something we'll do on the side. And it doesn't usually work out very well if you don't put something that hard at the center of your efforts. And so it was very, ebb and flow of attention to this, changing more affirmatively in the direction of, and more concertedly in the direction of trying to negotiate a political settlement only around the end of 2018. I mean, even in the Trump administration for the first year, there was a mini surge, again, trying to, turn around the war